Go ahead.
Videotaping some of the elements of the workshop that are informational, and then asking staff to view those videos before coming to the workshop, because the goal of the workshop is to create an opportunity for meaningful discussions about curriculum and revision to curriculum, in this case, rhetorically based research writing. And so I've tried to model that by presenting the agenda that Michael passed out to everyone, asking you to read the Joseph Bishop essay on being, sort of rhetorical vocabulary for teaching research-based writing, to bring along some technology, which I see many of you did, because I'm going to ask shortly, you can see from the agenda, for you to move into small groups to work to actually brainstorm revisions to your current activities or new activities that implement some of the elements from being. Now, because I wasn't certain the degree to which you would have access to those materials, I am going to give not necessarily a lecture, but a short orientation to the Joseph Bishop material, so that you do have an overview of it and can ask questions about it as well. But this isn't a sort of demonstration then of what I am sort of working toward as an administrator in terms of flipped professional development, which I hope will be presenting on the WPA conference in the fall. The first thing I want to do is kind of contextualize this issue. When I was given the opportunity to present the workshop, I gave myself a kind of prompt. And the prompt was something like this. As director of the writing program, you and your staff have determined that students are having difficulty with a particular element in their writing. You're seeing either through the portfolio assessment or through conversations in hallways that collectively you're seeing that students are really being challenged by using secondary sources or using sources in primary or secondary sources, either one, in their writing. So now compose a workshop in which you address this issue. And so that was the prompt I sort of gave myself for this activity. And I wanted to contextualize it too and direct you and point you, if you haven't or aren't familiar with this or haven't had a chance to look at it, the work of Rebecca Moore-Howard from Syracuse University, the Citation Project. Moore-Howard has done an extensive amount of work in plagiarism specifically, but research and resource-based writing more generally. And one of the things at the site for the Citation Project, but also in a presentation that she videotaped from 4Cs in 2011, you'll find a kind of discussion of the challenges that she sees students from across the university, from across the country, because the Citation Project also brings in students from a number of different institutions. And they've reviewed hundreds of samples of student writing to kind of come to an understanding of how students are using resources or source-based texts in their writing, what they're finding, of course, is that students are struggling with this. And so I just want to read this because it contextualizes my question. Howard finds that students are not, and I may see some nods here, right, as we read through this, are not selecting authoritative, meaningful sources. They're not reading their sources carefully. They're not talking with and about those sources. They are not, in a word, engaging with research, the reading, or the writing. Instead, they are quote mining simplistic random sources that are apparently chosen by no more sophisticated criteria than that they are easy to read and that they are on the student's topic. This is, in fact, sort of the circumstance that I find myself in as the director of the second level writing program at Ohio State. And so rather than have my first gesture be, why are the students doing this wrong, I step back and ask myself, how can I create a curriculum and how can I work with the instructors in my program to create curricula that will encourage students, that will motivate them to a different orientation to the sources that they're using when they write. And the answer to that question, in part for me, is Joseph Bishop's work, the beam, using sources rhetorically. And the beam article you'll see is written by Bishop to us. It's written to us as writing teachers. What can we do and how can we construct assignments in a way that will encourage students to engage their sources in more sophisticated fashion? Moore-Howard's research shows us, for example, and I'm not sure that I get these numbers exactly right, but that when students, and this is this huge data set that they have hundreds of papers, they went in and looked at all of the sources that students cited, and what they found was that the average length of a source that students used was 8 pages, or the equivalent of 8 pages. And when they quoted something like 75% of the time from just the first 3 pages of So they really, I mean, so this is one of the things that leads her, or Howard and her colleagues, to suggest that they are just looking until they get to the point in the text where they find a quotation that fits what they want to do. Now I've asked my students myself whether they use the strategy, and they say, yeah. They do. There's a, and, I say, is this how you do research? So it becomes a question, and it's an explicit conversation that we have in our classrooms. And I encourage the staff to have with their students. It was interesting to me that they, on the one hand, that I would see them as admitting this, right? That, yeah, that's what I do. And so then the next question is, well, why do you do that? Why is that the strategy you use? And you can probably predict what their responses were. It's worked in the past, right? I mean, so the K-12 education, right? Or the previous writing classes that they may have had, that's been a strategy that's worked. And also, they have said, I've not been taught how to do it any differently. Right? And so both of those things suggest to me, then we have a conversation about that. And I use V. So I want to work now from a couple of examples. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have or observations that you'd like to make as we move forward. What I wanted to do then first, as a way of demonstrating what I would like us to do during this workshop, is to give you an example. I need to pull John B. in first. Just a second. Documents of desktop. Just as a kind of quick review and orientation to this, we briefly introduce or reintroduce to you the notion of being, which is the acronym for using sources rhetorically as background, as an exhibit, as argument, or as method. John Bean's text, Engaging Ideas, if you're not familiar with this, is a great text, a great resource for writing instructors. And so in his book, Bean gives us a brief outline of the different elements of this acronym, of BISIP's Bean. So when I talk with my students about their research that they're doing, and I'll show you two activities that I use in my classroom that I've revised to accommodate Bean. I asked them to think about, and we begin talking about sources as in one of these four kinds of sources to use in their writing. So background sources, as Bean tells us, is any sort assumed to be non-controversial, used to provide context. I mean, this fits really actually very nicely with Jerry Graff and Kathy Wilkenstein's work, right? Where they say, I say the conversation. So the background materials are, elements of the conversation you might be entering. And so you can use sources to establish that context. The point here is the non-controversial context. It's not actually part of the argument that might be underway in the public sphere or in the academic sphere about the topic, but it provides background. And here you have some examples. And all of these materials are available on the script account that is included in the agenda. So these are all materials that are available to use or to revise however you'd like. This one I do pull from John B. The others are all. And then exhibits or evidence derived. Documents, again, how are you using the sources? As documents, data, field observations, images, and so forth. Particulars from exhibits are often used as evidence within a writer's argument. So what are you analyzing? I have a student currently working this semester on examining this notion of this, of what she's calling the social cigarette, which are these new addictions to social media. She's very interested in the principles, right, behind this, and actually the science behind it, because she's found that there are some sources that demonstrate that addiction to social media is actually a stronger addiction than alcohol or cigarettes, which is really fascinating. So she's investigating that set of principles. And so the question then for her becomes, if I'm using a secondary source as a piece of evidence, or if I'm examining or analyzing it, how am I using it as an exhibit? So instead of saying how many sources are you going to use, or how many sources do you find that are going to be addressing this issue, the question is how are you going to use those sources. Then the argument sources are those, the conversation of the critical views and relevant scholarships surrounding the question. And here, they say, I say, is actually the argument rather than the opening sort of conversation starter that we have a paper in science sharing here. And then finally, method, references to theories or methods that the writer is employing. This could also be concepts that are sort of fundamental elements of a source material. Generally speaking, this is of the four elements, of the four rhetorical uses of writing, is the one I find students are least comfortable using. And so, you know, BEAC doesn't work quite as well as BEAM, but the notion of what conceptually are you pulling from a piece that is a kind of strategy or methodology that you might use. They're very uncomfortable with the notion of methodology, too. And I'm speaking here about sophomore level writers, most of whom are in the humanities, right? Because that's who populates the courses that I teach. So this is the acronym: background, exhibit, argument, and methodology. So for me as a teacher, this created a really paradigmatic shift for me in how I teach research. Because now I give students this framework. And one of the things you might talk about when you move into your groups is this a framework you think students would be comfortable using? I presented this at the workshop before, and there's some question about, well, is it problematic to talk about the notion of method? And is there some other term? Maybe we can't use being, but maybe we can use some other concept that might be helpful. I actually give Bizup's article to my second year writing students, and I have them read it, so they get that source material immediately. Okay. So those are the four categories, just again, as a quick refresher. I have often, and for many years, I've asked students in my research-based courses, my second level writing course, to, as part of their requirement for their research paper, to do an annotated bibliography. Is that something? Yeah. So, you know, and so I thought, well, I like the notion of annotated bibliography because it at least gives me some orientation to the student's understanding of a particular source. Whether they can summarize, right? So there are a lot of skills that are involved in the creation of an annotated bibliography, but I would typically simply ask students to summarize the content and then also briefly evaluate the content. So what I've done here is actually, and I'm actually using this in my class this semester. You can see the students do on Monday. So I don't yet have the students' responses to this, but it's due on Monday. So this is the prompt I've given them, which is a revision from my typical annotated bibliography assignment, which is simply typically would say, compose a 4 to 5 item annotated bibliography in which you write, and I would typically say a 50 to 75 word summary and then probably a 50 to 75 word evaluation of the source. So now as I think about incorporating meaning and encouraging students to engage those sources differently earlier in the process of research, I revised this kind of thing, outlining how you use the sources, background, exhibit, argument, and this should actually say and/or method. Because I want them very early on to also recognize that a single source material can function in multiple ways rhetorically in a piece of writing. So this annotation would then, for example, and the example I have here is just of a single source. This is a real source. And the students in the class this semester that I'm teaching are writing about causes. So they have social causes, political causes, and so forth that they're interested in investigating. Just like the one student's looking at the addiction to social media. So here I'm going to give them a sample and show them what this kind of annotated bibliography might do. Now, I don't yet know how students will engage this question, right, this particular assignment, because they have yet to turn it in. But my hope is that by thinking very strategically earlier in the process than they might otherwise about how they're using some of the sources that they're finding will engage them differently. We'll go back to, I won't have students who are simply surfing to the point where they get a quotation on the first 3 pages and so forth. So this is just an example of how I've revised one of the activities in my classroom. And so it serves as a kind of model then too for what I'd like you all to do in the next 30 minutes. I'm going to ask you to, those of you who want to participate, to move into small groups of 3 or 4 4, probably a little bit better, make sure that one person has a piece of technology that will allow you to contribute to a shared document, which I'll project on the screen. And this, what the group does, I want the group to talk about, just with this brief example of how you might take an existing assignment and repurpose it a little bit, revise it a little bit to engage the questions of being, or how you already have an assignment that you think accomplishes similar goals, right? Even if it doesn't expressly use being. Right? And then as the group works and converses, I'm going to put up this meeting words doc, and you can serve to the URL, and I'd like each of the groups to contribute questions, comments, and examples to that working document, that shared document. It kind of will stand in as a reporting feature out of the groups. I'll still ask each of the groups to contribute to a conversation after the end of the workshop portion of this, but I also want a document that you all can turn to, where you can see what the other groups have done and the kinds of questions they've asked. And I'll use that as a point of departure as we close the session. But before I move you into groups, I would like to ask if you have any particular questions about being, about the activity that's on the agenda that I'm going to ask you to participate in, or just generally about the materials that are part of the workshop. Yes.
I'm curious about the last item, the method and theory. I mean, I'm thinking of our students. We have so much to do to try to get them to think about whether they're using historicism. They might understand feminist criticism. How do you prepare them for that?
Okay, that wasn't the question. Can you tell me your first name? Catherine. I thought you were going to ask a different question, so I was going to open it up for others to answer. No, that's okay. How do you prepare them for it? Well, honestly, I give a lot of examples, and I tend to ask them if they can see methodologies. So, for example, there's a graphic artist in my class right now who's actually looking at gun violence, and she's found through her research that, in fact, scientists, researchers have found that there is no correlation between the amount of viewing of violent video games that young people do and gun violence in the U.S., which was surprising to her. I think she thought, because she had assumed from public conversations that there was a direct link, that there was a correlation between those two things. And so methodologically, she's created a public service announcement. And so for her, methodology has to do with methodologies of graphic artists, right? So how do you think about visualizing an argument? For her, method isn't necessarily a methodological or an argument methodology or a structural methodology or even an inquiry or research methodology. It has to do with visualization, so a methodology that she might use as a graphic artist. This is the most complicated element in being, and I think it's the least clear to students. And that's why I think about concepts too. So if someone borrows, for example, from a particular source, a central paradigm, right, or a central concept that the student then uses to inform his or her understanding, like a feminist, the notion of invitational rhetoric, let's say. That's a methodology, that's an understanding, and then if I employ that in my writing, that's a methodology. It is, as I talk about this and give examples, do other examples come to mind about how we use method either as scholars, feminism and historicism, right? Where typically we're studying literature, we might come, or cultural studies, we might use those. But conceptually or methodologically, how do you talk to, and this was the question I was going to ask after I gave you a couple of examples.
Can you just I'm sorry, I don't have an example.
Oh, you shoot.
I know, I'm
Okay.
terribly waiting. But I also have a question. One of the things that makes it difficult is that it assumes that the student not only understands, let's say, the article they're reading, but that they can connect that to a larger body of knowledge, which can identify methodologies or paradigms or concepts, which I think, depending upon where you're at, that might not be as much of a problem, but I think that the students that we work with here oftentimes don't have that larger package of background knowledge to be able to identify different methodologies, and so it seems a different type of difficulty than just the unfairness of the concept.
And so as a result of that, and if that is the case, right, I'm I'm working, one of the things I would say is I'm working maybe with a different student population. This is a second level writing course, not a second semester writing course, right? And so it's not 161 per se. Sorry, I was going to pull Bean's example and show us the examples from Bean here, partly Catherine to answer your question. Is honestly, Kevin, that's part of the work I take on in the classroom. Right, again, remember, I'm teaching a second year writing course, not a second semester course. So part of this may just be where we find students intellectually, conceptually, socio-emotionally, and whether, but I also don't want to, I don't want to reject your observation, but I do want to say, well, maybe this is part of the work that we do in the writing classroom, which is to talk about, that's why the term method might not be a good one to use and why I want you to interrogate it. Maybe that's it. So here we have special references, this is what you said, Catherine, critical theories or methods and so forth. But citations to competing sociological theorists or theories about gender socialization, citations of scholars with particular research methodologies. But I want to even pull that back and say conceptually. Maybe it's not feminism as a whole, but maybe it's a concept from feminism that I adopt that's a principal element of what I then want to do in reading, say, representations of women in advertising.
I think that translates a little better for me because I'm thinking of students who are coming here with very concrete plans about where they're going to be. Many of them want to be pharmacists, and many of them want to be engineers. So that would be maybe more disciplinary perspective.
Right, and that's what might happen in the second year as opposed to the second semester. I also want maybe to submit for your consideration the idea that we function and work methodologically, but we don't always call it a method, right? A set of strategies that we use to engage texts. A method might be the Aristotelian structure of argument. Right? So my method could also be sort of a structural methodology, not necessarily a research methodology, which is what BISM is focusing on, I think. But so conceptually. But then so in that second level writing course, it does take some work. They don't simply read BISM and then come away with a full understanding. But that's something else that annotated bibliography assignment can demonstrate for me. The other thing I asked them to do by way of example is I actually have a second assignment, which I can pull up very briefly, is I actually ask them, before they do the annotated bibliography, this was due 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, I actually ask them after they've read the BISM article and then they also have a video, I have a video lecture that they view because I'm teaching in a blended environment, so I've constructed a videotape lecture where I actually work through BISM's own article to show how he uses sources. So I say, well, here's BISM, you just read BISM. Oh, look how he uses background sources. And then it's a video demonstration. So I show them the text and show them how he uses that. And so I demonstrate for them how I read BISM's article with an eye toward B. And so we get to the point of how does he use methodology and so forth. So I try to model this for them. And then I give them this assignment, which is to say, take one of the sources that you have, that you're investigating for your research project, and actually read it to see how that writer uses these approaches, these strategies. So I also use this as a reading exercise, really, for students, which I think helps them because a lot of the reading that they're doing, you can imagine, research on social media addiction can be pretty dense, right? And so I want to give them some strategies for engaging that rhetorically, and also, of course, understanding the content, which is what the annotated bibliography allows them to do. But so then I ask them to demonstrate their understanding of B. And this is where, in answer to these, this is why I know they have trouble with method. Because now I go to the discussion board where they've posted these assignments, and I can look through, and what I'm finding, of course, is that they're having a hard time picking out methodology from the sources that they're reading. So I go and I look at the sources. Well, sometimes writers don't use all 4 of these types of sources or use sources in the same rhetorical fashions every time. But if I go to a source and I find there really is a sort of methodology section or an employment of a source as a method, then when I respond to the discussion forums, I'll point those out. And I look at the discussion forums, and what I have found is that that notion of method is they have an ambiguous understanding of it. So then I have just-in-time learning. I go back to the classroom and we talk more about method, which is how I think, again, as I said, that they do struggle with this. And I've had other teachers suggest other ways of sort of framing the notion of method, and that's why the notion of concept is one of the ways of doing that.
Have you got examples in there, like, because I'm actually finding kind of a problem with the method too, not with the students doing it, but doing it myself. So do you have an example in there of what would be like the adequate statement? I mean, not something like I use new sources, like nobody actually know that answer, but I use something which would then fill in to sort of try to follow what give the students.
When I don't have anything actually prepared, but when you all break into the groups to work on the activity, I will disconnect and I will go back into the discussion forums for my students this semester and see what I find on this particular activity. As I said, they did struggle with it, so I'm not sure I can find an adequate example to address your issue, your question. But when I think myself, for example, Pedagogy of Possibility, one of my scholarly art books, I use concepts from Bakhtini. The method is a Bakhtinian method. I employ the notions of dialogue and multivocality, and I apply them to the composition classroom. The notion of a flipped classroom, the flipped professional development, that's a method.
Right,
So I'm really working today to actually implement, right, to employ a method in this presentation.
That's what seems, I mean, those are both really useful examples, but I guess what I was puzzled about it, they're also sort of different examples. Because they're kind of committed by team. It's like a commitment to a certain view of the way the world works.
Yes, it's epistemological. Yes.
So there's a kind of like sense that, yeah, there are these things in the world, there's this kind of literature that does this, it produces this question of conversation, carnival, et cetera, whereas the commitment to the flipped classroom is a commitment to like, well, if we do this, then we will get these results.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they both sort of come under method, but it seems like they're different kinds of things.
They
One's
are.
like a tool, well, they're both tools. I see how it's kind of a problem.
They are both tools. They're both I would say they're also both based in a kind of epistemology or understanding of how to read a text or how to facilitate a workshop. And they are tools. So maybe that's another term in addition to concept, tool, right? Method. What is good? Beat. But I'll try to look to see, Walter, if I can find an example where a student does this while you were working.
I definitely agree with Walter, and I think that, so what I would think is this would work well if we set up the entire class over the course of the term to, look at the world through that lens. I think students would really struggle with this, actually, if it was just thrown at them, as we are to some extent, because there's so many different ways we could apply that word method.
There are, and I will say that there's a semester-long set of assignments. We present being to them in like the second week.
So
and actually we present
particular, I saw you had the feminist, you're using Judith Butler, for example.
That was John Bean's example.
Okay.
Yes, that was from John Bean's book.
But do you do that with your own class? Do you have two or three, feminist viewpoints and sort of explore those throughout the...
The students come up with what those are themselves.
Okay.
And they're independently working on, some of them are collaborating, but they're working independently on investigating social cause. Researching it in a public sphere, researching it in the academic sphere, pulling together and synthesizing what those conversations look like and how they're argued rhetorically. And then they contribute to that conversation by creating a public service announcement. Right? So they pull out one example, like the social cigarette, right? And then they also do a larger research project, which can be variously configured.
Are they English majors?
No, they are not. I have a graphic artist, an engineer, a physicist. I don't know that anyone's an English major in that particular group because it's just a required GEC course, that they take them. But the first thing we do very early on is before we even introduce, and this is a pilot of 3 sections of 20 of our second level writing course. There's 3 instructors engaged in this. The first thing we do is actually ask them just to look at B. We don't even introduce BISA. We just say, start looking around in the public sphere about your topic. Just start paying attention. And from that, we ask them to build the background. What's the source of the conversation? And then we introduce argument, right? So what's the source or context of the discussion? What are the terms of the argument, right? So we introduce it to them gradually. Then we have them reading, and we talk about exhibits and how they might then analyze texts or artifacts for their final research project. They just introduce them in week 2, and they don't complete the research project until about week 12 out of the 14-week semester. So, but you're right, it is a lot. But it does, and this is why I want, as part of the conversations that you all have, is are you already engaging students in activities that achieve these same ends, even without using B? Right, so I want sort of 2 conversations to kind of develop in your conversations. Are you already engaging and share with one another the activities that you're currently using that you think already encourage or motivate students away from quotation mining, right, and not engaging their sources? Or imagine how you might take an existing activity and sort of infuse it with a beam-like sense or set of exercises or activities. Okay. So if you are interested in participating in the activity, could I ask that, or should I make you? Like, who would like to participate in a small group to have a discussion around? Okay, so if you maybe if you could